So again, today, talking about doing estimates for large transformations. I had in the title, I think, with or without consultants. I'll talk a little bit about the consultants, let's say, and what they do well and not so well. I'll probably throw that in there as we go through the material. Okay, so let's get started. Again, this is my. Is it not advancing? Come on. Come on. Wow, it's slow. This happened to me before. Oh, there we go. It's got a real lag. Come on. Wow. I'm gonna have to have like intermission speeches for. Oh, come on. It's funny every time I. Okay, here we go. That's me. I normally actually wear this shirt, but it's in a dry cleaner. But again, a little bit about me, and this is my only advertising slide. Throughout my career, I've been in consulting. I've been with a large software vendor, SAP, and I've been in industry at some large Fortune 500 companies in IT leadership roles. I've always, or not always, but for all my industry jobs, I had some sort of architecture leader role. Last one being the head of enterprise architecture and IT strategy at Caterpillar. And now, since February, I've been consulting independent and very happy. So, if anybody wants to make that career move, I'm happy to help out. It's a lot of fun. Down on the bottom left, you'll see that everywhere. That's my website. Easy way there. You can actually contact me there if you want to talk for something for a couple of minutes. I'm free. If you want a longer engagement, I start asking for money. So that's my company advertising. I had Tumor Advertising. I added here is I'm on the board of a nonprofit organization called We Inspire. Their mission is to spread positive news. We get inundated with negative news, and I like the idea of their concept of sending out positive news events, and with that they sponsor students that are editors in college, and they get experience, and there's all kinds of stuff around it. But check them out. And then another thing is a little bit of advertising is I'm on the advisory board of a e-commerce startup. If people are interested in board of director jobs, they come with some investment. I'd be happy to just contact me. I'd be happy to let you know what this company is. I can't give much details without someone signing an NDA, but those are my other two advertisings I thought I'd throw in there. So, and again, I don't know if you've ever been a board director on startups. It's not uncommon that they ask for a serious amount of money to get into the game. So it's, I don't want to lead anybody in the wrong way. It tends to be a relatively risky investment, but we recently hired a very good CEO for the company, so I think we're at a point where it might be a good time to jump in. Okay, those are my two advertising spiels here, and here's more of the content. So I alluded this to some folks before that were early on the call of what experiences my approach is based on that I'll talk about. I did work at, wow, the animation's even slow now. Maybe I should relog in my Wi-Fi or something on my iPad. But I worked for SAP, and then came. Oh wow, the animation is really interesting. Don't know why it's not even working. Deloitte was my next gig, and then, like I said, I went to industry, which was, oh, there we go. That's how it's supposed to look. Then I went to PepsiCo, what I call my first real job in a large SAP-enabled transformation. And then I went to Caterpillar, also doing SAP work, but then quickly became their chief architect. Carsten, I think you have your hand up. Is that right? I see somebody with a hand up. Who's got a hand up? Yeah, Carson, you got a hand up? You're on mute? No? His hand is down. Okay. Okay. Like I said, I hope the animation gets better. Otherwise, I might re redo my internet here. But at the end of the day, this is where it comes from. So you can see a lot of it is based on large ERP transformations. We did a lot of other stuff, but you'll see that's kind of what the approach is kind of based on in this talk. Okay. Wow. Okay, I am going to get out of this presentation and look at my internet. Hope it doesn't totally disconnect me. It probably did, huh? No, I'm still there. Good. Let me see. Get back on this one. Let's see. Okay. Well, we're at least at the right slide. So what I did is I just basically there is actually I thought I missed a slide. I kind of did miss a slide. What typically you'll see is on the left there are cost components that make up a typically I was gonna write these out, but I see I missed one slide. I got a little bit ahead of myself. But and these are about work that typically gets done by different teams in a transformation. So we always start listing, and you might have more granular, you might bunch more together, but these are kind of the big ones for what I'd say a typical large IT project of an off-the-shelf product. Again, if you're doing pure custom code, I've done that too, and you kind of just stick with the development object model, and you can do the same thing. Again, I'm more familiar, let's say, with off-the-shelf software implementations. So there's typically people that do process design and configuration. There's this you have to design, test, build development objects like interfaces and so on. Then you got to do different kinds of testing depending on your methodology. There's always change management training involved. There's some sort of leadership team on these larger transformation that's not to be ignored in terms of size. And then, especially on these large ones and small ones, some of these supporting functions are kind of absorbed by back office overhead, I'd say. But when you get into larger implementations, you want to make sure you capture all these. So things around security, identity management, controls that have experts that know that area. And then there's the whole software management, infrastructure, networking. So people that are taking care of the kernel of the software and installing it and getting the right infrastructure in place and make sure the network hums and all that kind of stuff. And then after you do the work, you go live and you typically have some sort of hypercare. And if it's not a big bang kind of one install approach, you have some sort of deployment plan. And then on the right here, I started listing typical factors that go into these models. So a couple of things to note is you see on, let me see if, let's see what color I'll use. Red looks good. So when you see things like activity level, whether it's level 4, 5, 2, 3, or whatever, but there's typically, the way I describe it is you have kind of this high-level process area like purchasing, and then within purchasing you probably have a lot of different, maybe you have a different kind of sub-processes, and then within, so things around actually purchase order management to vendor onboarding to whatever, you have these next level, and then you get down to a level where it's actually create purchase order, escalate purchase order. I don't know, you get down to what I'd call then the activity level of detail. Depending on your model, that aggregation is pretty high and then goes down to some certain level. So I can't tell you whether it's 4, 5, 3, depending on your model, but it's that last level. It's not the individual step of a process, but kind of a small end-to-end process, like in the purchasing example, create purchase order or create change view purchase order, create vendor, things like that at that level. And then within there, you need to understand in your implementation, are these going to be brand new to us? Is it something that I'll use SAP because I've got all my experience in SAP. Let's say you already are in SAP, you're making some change, and it changes your create purchase order process, then that would be called a change activity. And new is if, let's say you're moving from Ariba to Coupa, the processes are probably brand new for folks. It's on a new piece of software, you'd mark it as new. And then test only is, you got to be a little bit careful that if you have to do intensive testing through your end-to-end process, although you might not be changing the activity, you might have to run test scripts through it and things like that. So you mark those as test only. And then similar thing on these. This is a typical SAP term, and there's probably more acronym letters now on it because of all the different development objects we have nowadays. But that's reports, interfaces, conversions, enhancements, forms, workflows. There could be more, portal front end. You can have different development objects, and again, you have the same kind of concept. Is this brand new? Am I just changing one that already exists, or do I need to make sure I test this interface with this other thing because I'm changing some app that integrates with something else? That'd be test only. And then there's kind of overall scale of the program, and then there's sizing information, which typically your vendor gives you that information, and then sites and deployment waves are kind of factors that go into these estimates. So and then you can map this. So typically, why is it? Oh, okay. So typically, if the process design configuration is very much dependent on your activities. Then your development object design, build, and test is very dependent on your development objects. Your testing strategies are very dependent on both. So these two here. Change management is very much, again, based more on the way the process changes. Project management office is really a bit more related to the overall scale of the project. Identity management security is mainly, again, around how do you have to secure these different activity steps, activities, and what controls are there around them, so it's influenced by that. And then software management and networking is really actually a lot of this stuff as a whole. And then specific sizing information, again, that you get from the vendor. And then hypercare tends to be related, again, to the overall scale of the program, and actually often is just some sort of factor of how much did I spend here, and X% I'll keep around during hypercare. And then deployment typically depends on how you're deploying and how many waves, and then how many sites you have that you have to deploy to and how you're set up. So at a high level, you can then map, those get mapped to the different work that has to get done. These are kind of the cost drivers. So hopefully that explains that. And then if you then look at the you want to have, so you have typically have a model that describes, so here is what we just went through at a high level, the components of the type of work. Here are the cost drivers that we just mapped to that type of work. And then you also want to know typically what teams get impacted by this type of work. So this typically there's business and IT process team members that are more focused. The IT often have then configuration experts for off-the-shelf products, and it's more so this impacts that group of people on a project that are either business experts in the business processes that you're implementing, changing, and IT people that also then know how to configure the software to those processes. Um, Development objects typically is more of a process team, IT members. They also know, well, if this process goes along that, I got to send this information from here to here for interfaces. I need this enhancement to make this thing work the way my customer wants it. And the development teams get impacted by that, and so on. If you go down, integration test is basically both major teams. Performance user test, same thing. Change management, there tends to be a change management team, and process teams again get involved in change management activity. There's typically a relatively small change management team, but they need a lot of time and energy from the people that actually know what's going to change and how I should create then the training materials or the change management plan. There's the program management office in these large transformations. And then there's a process risk and controls team I mentioned earlier. I think this is a Deloitte term, but there are then experts, and on these larger transformations, they're actually pretty much full-time during the major design, build, test phases of the program to help with security aspects and authorizations and things like that. And then there's the software management team in the SAP world. It's called BASIS. And then they're also here in terms of the effort estimate, which doesn't relate to this activity base. There's obviously hardware and software costs. And the deployment tends to involve all teams get involved, depending how you develop your deployment plan, which then typically depends on how many waves you have, how long those waves are, and what you think you need for a deployment, and then the sites that are in there. So now you have basically the type of work, what drives that work, and then who's needed to do that work is typically driven again by these drivers. So it's important to get these drivers right as you're creating an estimate. So now if you, this is the kind of the meat of the thing, is, how do you obtain these, right? Typically here in the level 4 or 5 activities, you need some sort of process or capability model, right? Otherwise, you're kind of lost. You need to clearly understand your scope, right? What's in, what's out. And then, this whole thing on the activities, which ones are newly changed and test only. In the development world, you basically have, what reports are needed to deliver, integrations needed, conversions needed in terms of master and transactional data, software gaps that need to be filled with enhancements, external, internal forms that need to be created that you might send to business partners or need internally, workflows or, bot kind of automations that you need to make the process hum. And then all those development objects, you need to know the complexities also. So it's complexity, new, change, and test only. On the activity model, which is kind of tricky, you assume that each activity is about the same level complexity. Again, nothing's perfect, but it tends to be about right. And then sizing information, again, work with your vendor. The vendor knows what you need to know to be able to then size your infrastructure. And then the deployment is you really need to develop some sort of deployment plan. How are you actually going to roll this thing out? And then there's typically, which we'll get in later, there's kind of a COE in the center, and then there's sites out there. And there's maybe a couple of people out here on the site helping, and then there's this kind of a center SWAT team that's around the COE. And then once you've kind of figure out how you want to do this, you can do the math of, how many people, how long are they out there? Okay, I can figure out my deployment costs. do not underestimate deployment costs. It can be pretty work intensive, and then thus expensive. If you're rolling out across a lot of sites and you think as a company you need a lot of hand-holding, it's not something you can easily roll out by people just calling some sort of help desk if they run into issues. Don't underestimate how much this can cost here, the deployment. And then there's these general business characteristics, and this is kind of funny if you look at these estimating models that companies have, is they always have this kind of main sheet with things like, is this a template rollout? Which would be a lot easier because you're not really, if you're doing it right, you're not really blueprinting. You're telling. You're saying, no, don't tell me how you do your purchasing processes. I will tell you how it works. I don't need to interview you. I don't need to ask you any questions. I'm going to tell you how it works, and I'm going to set it up, and I'm going to train you on it. So that obviously influences the amount of effort. Then there's general business characteristics. If you're extremely decentralized with many different business units, to roll out a purchasing process might be a lot harder because every business unit thinks they want it their way, and you got to convince every business unit, and every business unit has a voice, and again, it might be different if you're more of a command control, military kind of based organization where you just tell people. Well, that's a lot easier to implement these things than everybody has a voice. We used to joke at Caterpillar that I think 99-1 is a tie, I think is what we called it. So if not everybody was happy, you got to make everybody happy, which is extremely cumbersome and time consuming to then implement stuff like this. So, and this is kind of interesting because these factors here, they impact the entire model and really swing the estimate. And why am I telling you all this is if you remember from my background, these folks, I'd say these, I very often estimate for you. And they'll have models where in this little business capability click, they just do a 0.2 or some factor change. It can cost you millions of bucks. So that's why I'm saying these things, because these companies, I can tell you here, when I worked here, they used a model which was very similar to the model here. Then here we developed a model which was similar to this model. And here they had a model, then kind of let it kind of die a little bit because they went on a break with their ERP and then started reviving it. But in all these models to do this, they were pretty much all the same, driven off of those factors that I just talked about. And what's, again, very important is these guys use it, right? They'll use two things. They'll want to try to estimate what your work is, and they'll want to try to figure out how much money you have. If the estimate's bigger than the money you have, they'll just quote the money you have if they somehow find out what the budget is for the program. So let's say it takes $5 million to do an implementation and they realize you only have 4, they're going to quote you 4. They're not going to quote you 5 because they know they're going to lose the deal. Again, like I said, be careful when dealing with consultants. I've worked with them. I've been one. I know how they operate. They will not admit this, but they do this. I can guarantee it. Part of a pursuit, typically what the partners did, the more senior people, is really understand how important this is for the customer, how much they're willing to pay. How they made sure, as much as they could, that whatever we came up with in the back room, like the worker bees when I was at Deloitte, that put the estimate together to say, well, you got to tame that down, or can be kind of, and if they're more ethical, they'll actually then admit that, hey, we're going to assume this thing over here, which drives the estimate down, and they're going to be vocal or hide it a little bit, maybe, depending on how the partner decides in the presentation. Where am I? Okay. I then I'm going to go a little bit more into how to collect these different factors because they're important. And again, why this is important is if you're listening to, and again, not all consulting companies are evil, but at the end of the day, they think about it. It's their product, right? They want to optimize their profit. You can't hold it against them that they're going to try to make this whole thing as attractive as they can for you to buy. So I'll go through the different ways. And what's important is that your company actually knows how to do this. If you're a company that basically has a couple of people, not the bandwidth to do all this, and just goes to consultants and say, okay, let me have these 3 consulting companies big against each other and pick the best, in my opinion, you're gambling a lot, because they do not know your company as well as you do. They do not know the exact situation. They can't get to these factors in a level of accuracy that if you don't have the people who can do this in your company, they're going to have to kind of wing this. And that then has huge influence on the dollar amount. And then again, the dollar amount or effort amount is going to be very dependent on what they think you can spend versus what it'll actually take. And then you get change orders as you go along. Okay, so activities, like I mentioned, you typically have some sort of capability model. This is the high level. And then within each one, so you might go, okay, this is a supply and demand planning project, and then under here you probably have lower level processes. So there's here, and then there's the lower level, and then there's a couple lower level, and there are some processes. And each one of those you go, okay, yes in scope, it's new. Yes in scope, it's just a change. Yes in scope, it's just a test only. And you just go through and you mark them. Okay, so that's how you typically, and again, a important reason to have an agreed upon model. And what's interesting in these models is, unless you want to then put weighting factors on the activities, is try to make your activities relatively balanced. Don't have activities that are like a one step, it's just hit a button and a report comes up. And another activity is like 18 steps, because then you're relative. Then you have to get into kind of weighting the activities and saying, this is a big one, this is a small one, this is similar to the RISE-F, saying they're complex, not complex, and so on. Because at the end of the day, the development objects, you don't have much choice. If an enhancement's complex, well, you don't want to break it into 3 small enhancements and describe it in 3 different ways. You just have one enhancement and it's complex or medium, and so on. Processes, you can kind of try to get your process hierarchy or your capability hierarchy to be somewhat balanced. Okay, so that's activities. And by the way, just raise your hand if you have questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to zoom through this. Then integrations, you have some sort of, what was funny? I went on Google, and I always love to get things from Google Images. I couldn't find a nice integration diagram. They were all different. And they were all kind of like, wait, this is not what I'm talking about. So maybe I'm calling it the wrong thing. But you have basically apps and data stores that talk to each other. So the DW are data warehouses or data stores, and then there's maybe something in the middle here. You see something that's kind of an enterprise bus or an enterprise data warehouse. You can see a lot of things talk to the enterprise bus, and then you have these arrows, and you need to understand what objects could pass from A to B. What are these interfaces? Might not just be one line. This might be 6 of different things. It's I got to send, change, create sales order information. I got to send, create, change, customer. I got to send, etc. Yeah. Oh, this is activities. Yeah. Yeah, this isn't meant for. So remember on the cost drivers, okay, the first one was activities. Right. And then and this is just a high level. So typically people have some sort of capability model. Again, if you don't, or a lot of smaller companies can't afford to spend the time to bother. By the way, often these vendors like SAP will have one built in. You can just use theirs. And they'll go to, I think they call it scenarios, processes, and steps or something like that. And in their solution manager, and the steps are basically create sales order, whatever. So again, here I should have probably circled purchasing. Where is it? Vendor relationship management. This looks like this might be all purchasing. Oh, here's procurement. So often this is like the high level, and these are your sub processes, right? And then under here, you have all the different activities that you do for vendor management, right? And those are the ones that count. Each one of those equates to like a count of one activity, new, change, test only, or N for not in scope, or yes for in scope. So you just, and typically what can companies have, they have that in some sort of Excel format or something, unless they've developed some sort of fancy tool, and you just go through and you have this whole thing in a gigantic Excel spreadsheet, down to the activity level, and you go through and you say what is in scope, what isn't, and is it new, changed, or test only. So now this gets to integration. So what I'm basically doing is going through these drivers, right, and how to get them in a bit more detail. What's typically what people do. So typically here for the activities, they have a capability or process model. For the integrations, you have some sort of a wire diagram often, or you have this in some sort of architecture tool stored, or again, you have use Excel sheets that tell you what app talks to what app, what does it send, and so on. But pictorially, this is typically what I see. And then their arrows, they're either one way or two way. And then, like I said, each arrow could be more than one thing, but you have kind of the different objects that get sent next to it. So maybe sales order, purchase order, vendor. Well, the buses, this is like, in the SAP world, it's if they still call it XI, or it's a TIPCO, or it's a WebSphere, whatever the different middleware tools are. SnapLogic is an integration tool. I don't know if it's also a bus, but that's really a cloud-based one. But this is just an integration bus. That's typically for event-based integrations. When you have an event happen in an app, it subscribes to it, and then it publishes to apps. So it might subscribe to this app for PO changes, and then once it gets into the bus, it goes, okay, I just received a PO change event. I know these guys, this app over here and this app subscribe to that, so I better push the PO change also to those apps. So this is just typically what people have. They have some middleware tool, but not everything goes through it, because there's some projects that were either it's historical, or well, it's a lot cheaper if I just do point to point, and I don't want to spend the money figuring out the bus here. There's some complexities in this. Has its huge advantages, especially for reuse and error handling and all this kind of stuff. But they go, well, you know what? No, this is so. I'm just going to not use the bus. I'm going to do this. This is cheaper to just do this. So you typically have this kind of mixed. You also have data warehouses that might service a single app or multiple apps. Actually, I should have probably drawn more single apps. That happens a lot. Versus everything getting fed to the enterprise data warehouse as it matures. It's just people often have these two things in their environment here. Should probably start erasing this, or it's going to get ugly. So you basically have some diagram that shows what connects with what and what objects. And then for each one of them, so let's say, and then what you do is you figure out, okay, what am I replacing? Which I think is my build. Yeah. So let's say you've figured out that, okay, with this process scope earlier that I had, what's going to happen is this app's going to go away, this app's going to go away, this app's going to go, and this data warehouse here, I'm going to nuke. You just determine that with your architects or whoever does the pursuit work. That's what's going to go. Sometimes what happens, which I didn't point out here, is maybe half of it goes away, which creates other complexities. But let's say you're just clean and all these go away. Then obviously you have to worry about, okay, this data warehouse was always expecting this information from here. This app was sending and expecting information from within this blue thing, okay? This is self-contained. That's all nice, right? Ooh, the enterprise data warehouse was assuming some information. So, okay, I probably have to replicate or change these integrations, right? Because most likely whatever information is stored here, the enterprise data warehouse is still interested in. Okay, so this is how you then basically get your interface count. And then these interfaces are, again, they have a complexity rating. Some are very simple. Maybe transferring inventory information might be a lot easier than changing your customer master data. I'm just making that up, but there are different interfaces. Obviously, some to the data warehouse could be very simple. I just publish very simple information, and some of them between the apps might be a lot harder. And often between the apps is harder because all the things around, does this app accept this, all the error handling possibilities that can happen, and all this kind of stuff you have to think through, make the interfaces more complex. Okay, so and then with this, you're basically counting these that I circled, and you get your list of interfaces with complexity, and again, are they new, change, or test only? So now you understand kind of your environment from what kind of integration work you have to do. And another thing that I didn't mention was you might have interim states, right? So let's say your deployment plan is, I'm first going to remove these in wave 1, and wave 2 I'm going to remove this and this. Oh, now I have interim interfaces I have to do between wave 1 or 2. Or what could happen is this app gets used by business unit 1 and 2, and this one also by business unit 1 and 2, and let's say this is just a business unit BU1 in BU1, BU1. Let's say you implement by business units and you first do business unit 1. Now you still have to keep this alive and this alive for business unit 2. So then you have to kind of redraw it for what do I have to do for this interim state for business unit 2, because in business unit 1 I'm getting rid of all this, but not for business unit 2. So again, understanding how you're going to deploy it is very important because it leads to these interim states, which again, if you ask someone about how do you do these things most efficient, it's always big bang. The problem is, can you absorb that from a business change perspective? Can you absorb the big bang? And will the big bang be so complex that you stop shipping for 3 weeks and or your efficiency for 2 months just drops? The value of despair. Typically, when you implement something at first, when you implement it first, productivity goes down, then it goes up, and it takes a while for you actually to take advantage of the new system, new benefits. Oh, great handwriting. I might as well not even write, but it takes some time for you to get to this point where you're actually equal to where you were before, and then you start getting better at it. So you might want to slice this up so that it's more like, your benefits versus, right? Some companies don't want to take this hit, especially executives, because it hits their stock package. That's another. So don't forget about these interim states, and then you have to basically estimate the work between these interim states. Okay, that's it on integrations. Conversions, basically after you've circled this, you need to then understand, I don't know if this thing builds. No, it doesn't. You need to understand, okay, this app, it might have certain master data and transactional data. That you need to convert into the new system. Okay, and that gets you then the list of conversions. And again, certain conversions are easier, certain are harder. For example, let's say these are all disparate apps, and your master data for certain things is spread over several apps, and there might be duplicates between this and this app that you then have to get in and try to clean, across these two apps, and the quality of the data. So again, your conversions will have complexity. Like I said, converting your inventory levels is probably a lot easier than converting your customer record. Right? And then also, depending on how that data is dispersed over your company, can influence the complexity of these conversions. But again, at the end of the day, when you know your scope, you know what's housed in these applications, and you can think about, okay, my new app needs all these things to run, and it needs things that integrated with it, and integrated with these. So typically, it's whatever data at the end of the day these apps needed, you'll need to run your new app, and maybe more. And then you might also have to consider some, let's say you turn this reporting off, you might have to push some old historic data into a new data warehouse that comes with your blue system. So let's say you have a new data warehouse. Okay, this is supposed to replace that. I probably need some history and things like that. Maybe these even need history for certain transactional processing and so on. But at the end of the day, it's whatever you carved out gives you a good indication of what you need to run, run your new application that's replacing all these. And then same thing, complexity and new change test. Only a test only doesn't really apply. I think you might already have conversion programs. Typically, these are all new for the circumstance. Doing conversions, by the way, is a lot of work, mainly because of this clean. I remember way back when I worked at SAP, I read an article which was interesting. It said, we're not sure whether implementing ERP is where you get all the money from, or the fact that the ERP forces you to finally clean up your data. That's where the business benefit comes with. And if you would have stayed on your own old systems with clean data, you might be running just as well. So I thought that was kind of an interesting observation. But often systems don't work well because your data is just bad. The old saying of, garbage in, garbage out. Jeff, you had a question? Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's typical for many, many things. There is in the reporting world, it's interesting, there's a new strain of thought for the people who are heavily leveraging AI, ML, and those kind of things. It's like, no, you don't need perfect data in your data warehouse. You don't even need it structured. Because I go in there and my smarts will figure out what data is clean or not, pick that out, kick the anomalies out, and then write your report all real time. Okay, sure. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. Yeah, and sizing information, like I said, typically your vendor. Okay, guys, we've got 8 minutes. Maybe you guys need to connect afterwards. So sizing information, typically there is, the vendor will tell you that they have certain, or I think I drew, they might have certain, like a data warehousing tool, they have different apps, they need to maybe go on different servers and so on. And then typical sizing information is like number of sales orders, maybe per day that you process, times the line items, or how many number of POs you do and line out. They'll ask you to fill out these sheets, and that will then determine your hardware. So that typically your vendor helps you with if you're going with an off the shelf. If it's your own, then you got to figure out different, probably similar things. If you're custom develop it, to figure out what you need in terms of hardware. Sites and deployments, what typically you see is if you're a manufacturer, you have something like a manufacturing site. You have often DCs, and then you have maybe offices, and then you have, like I said, you have some COE or something. So typically what happens is a couple of people sit here in mission control, and they service all these people. And then there's hands-on people here, especially, let's say, for shop floor controls. The operator doesn't really understand how the new things work. And you go, no, take this and scan this barcode and blah, 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 blah. You might need people sitting in the factory helping people. And figuring out how you're going to do this is something that takes a little bit of work. And then, like I said, you have waves. You might have wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4. So this is your initial go live, and then you might, let's say you do it by business unit 1, business unit 2, or you do it by, DC 1 through 6 and DC 7 through 10, and you have deployment waves. And then don't forget, these waves might have interim states, which you need to account for, because you need to build the stuff to support the interim state. So that will give you typically. And then I mentioned the business characteristics. I won't go into, how complex is it to make decisions in your business, which I always say about decentralized global companies with multiple business units, and you want to go too common is a freaking nightmare. It has a huge, huge impact on your estimate. And again, these factors are in all these estimating models from the consultant, and if they turn those just a little, that dial just a little bit, your estimate goes up or down a lot. So you might want to ask them about what assumptions they're making about your company. And then how these models get fed. So all those companies I mentioned, they all had a model like this. So again, there's something that effort estimating model for the work effort. It then can translate it effort by team, and then you have some sort of blended rate, and that gives you the dollars of what it costs. Software needs and sizing, there's some sort of software bill of material, sizing info to tell you what you need. There's then hardware sizing models, same thing. This software sits on so many servers and I don't know what. And then this sizing information tells you how big you have to make those servers, or what kind of cloud compute nowadays you probably need, right? And then you get some sort of hardware bill of material, which gets you dollars, and that gives you the dollars, the total effort. Again, like I said, all those companies I worked for, they all did it. You could have almost, the SAP model to estimating to Deloitte, you could have almost just created a copy. It was so similar. And then the importance of effort estimates. So, so it is challenge the consulting companies by asking for effort estimates used for their proposals. Don't ask for dollars. Now, at the end of the day, of course you're going to ask for dollars, but if you want to sanity check them, tell them how much work it is. Ask them how much work it is. I want to know how much work it is. Okay. By the way, even if it's a fixed bid can be a total nightmare, because at the end of the day, what they do with fixed bid is they make it their assumptions are like a Bible-sized book of assumptions. And they'll come back to you, well, this assumption isn't true, therefore change order so-and-so to the fixed bid. Oh, this assumption isn't true, therefore change order to the fixed bid. Oh, this assumption isn't true. And what you end up doing is you end up paying so much to manage the fixed bid contract, you might as well just gone time and material. So depending on your relationship, I know fixed bids are very popular. For these large things, they can be a nightmare in terms of just back and forth legal arguments, not necessarily you get lawyers involved, but just arguments about, well, this wasn't part of the fixed bid, this was blah, 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 can be pretty much a nightmare. But very important to go to effort. You can then always apply the rates to figure out, okay, you're going to put so much offshore, which is this much and this, or you can say, you know what, no, I'm going to do that part of the work. I don't want you doing that part of the work. Therefore, this should go off your bid because I'm going to bring people to do that. Okay? So it's, to me, especially in these large transformations, it's incredibly important you have a team that knows how to do this. Otherwise, the consulting companies will take advantage of you. They should. I mean, it's their business. I mean, they won't be. They typically are somewhat ethical, but they want to make money. You can't blame them. They're going to take advantage of you. They are not aware. I didn't understand that part. Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah, exactly, yes. So, working actually, and what's interesting is, which I thought was phenomenal at Pepsi, we got so good at Pepsi at it, we didn't ask our consultants for estimates, we told them. The only time we want estimates is just to say, okay, I want to see whether someone's going to, give me a better price at the end of the day. But we pretty much, yeah, we told them. And then we knew, we didn't ask them. We were like, this project is this much. Yes. Yes. And it puts you, it's a huge advantage because you're in the driver's seat. And then what you always want to do is you want to do this experience-based sense check. Sorry, we're done in like a minute, but I think I'll be done. So draw up the team. Actually, literally draw it out. Who's going to be what? Let's say the scope is procurement and finance. I'll just make that up. Draw up. Here's the finance team. Here's the procurement team. Here are the developers that are going to come over this period of time. They're going to ramp up from here to here. You're going to, draw it up, and then also maybe, and then have this see here, see how that compares. You actually draw up how the staffing is going to go over time, and it's got to add up to the hours of the effort that you have, and it's got to add up by kind of team type by the effort you have, right? And see if that makes sense. Same thing as compared to other projects you've done. And always do both. So because your model can be off, again, because of these weird little factors, and you go, once you draw it up, you go, really? Does it take this much to do it? And you might see where there might be a flaw or something, but do both to kind of look at it. And so kind of a model-driven and experience-based driven approach to estimating, and then see if the whole thing makes sense. In terms of warning, this I think was my last slide. This gets back to the a lot of companies just hand proposals to consultants and say, well, let me know what it takes. And they don't thoroughly understand your company. Especially the larger and more complex you get, you have so many weird things that the consultants would never guess. I'll give you one example. Again, it might have been obvious to the consultant, but when I was at Caterpillar, they did their inventory valuation last in, first out. And so what huge benefit it was, there's stuff still in inventory somewhere that might be years old and very cheap. So the things on it has a huge impact on your balance sheet and your statements on what you have, right? It was such a huge number, but SAP doesn't support that. And the amount of customizations they had to make to do that is ridiculous. And you might then want to think, do I change the business process or do I? But, and there's, that's just one example of, but there's so many weird rigmarole things that people might do that you understand and the consultant doesn't. And what that might mean in terms of change management or in terms of what I have to do different in this company in terms of change that might really increase the price tag because it's a lot more complicated for you than they think. Another interesting one was a negative BOM we had, which is they had a bill of material that had everything on it, and what it would do is take things off that you're not needing. Like let's say you have a configurable product, it would just start. So it's very bizarre, and that structuring your bill of materials that way is totally foreign to a company like SAP. Totally foreign actually in the industry, but because they had homegrown systems, that's how they were used to doing it. That's not a trivial change because it goes all the way from engineering to manufacturing engineering to actually how it gets built in the shop floor. All that would have to change if you switch that approach, right? And these are some of these are bigger, the consultants will figure out, but a lot of them are just hidden things that are awkward that your company might do where they go, once they get in the project, like, I didn't know you do that. Well, that we can't do, and I don't know what, and so on. So all these things, your people know a lot better than the consultants. And then they also don't know, yeah, in that they don't know the detail of your RT architecture, all the weird hidden things you do that you have to unravel. It's something, if you're not involved, they don't know that. And then, you're letting someone do who doesn't know how hard it is to do work at your company, right? It's very different if you work at a command control place versus a everybody kumbaya collaborative, make everybody happy, or every business unit has total autonomy compared to corporate, so they get to do whatever they want. A lot harder to implement than somewhere that's very process focused, the same, or just the word process focused. Some companies, you ask their people to write down a business process, they're like, I don't know, I only know this much of it. I do this when I come in. Don't tell me how this all hangs together. I have no clue. Versus some companies are very good at that. All those things can have an impact of, and those things your consultants just don't know. And then if you rely so much on your consultants, get ready for a galore of change orders. And if you let them estimate too, even if they know what they're doing, there are some, I can tell you, that are a lot more, evil is such a bad word, but they will purposely lowball in and change order you to death. It's a very common practice. Very, very common. If you had to put all consulting companies somewhere on a wall, more than half of them do what I just said. Oh yeah, it only takes this much. Don't worry. Yeah. And then once they're in there, they'll start change order this, change order that, change order this. Oh, you didn't tell me that. Change order. Which is why companies start liking fixed bids, because that supposedly turns that off, but in reality it doesn't. And I think that's it. Hey, I went over. That's unusual, but we started a couple of minutes late. So thanks for those that hung in here. And any questions before I say goodbye? It is a universal, more in application software development. Have it be, and I think yeah, you can apply it to developing it and buying off the shelf. If you're doing some sort of infrastructure program, if you're basically doing a cloud migration, I don't think this applies. I mean, there's components of it that can happen, but that's a very different effort than, like you say, switching ERPs. Absolutely. But if it's a pure, I want to implement software defined WAN. You're not going to use this to figure that out. I'm going to implement, I'm going to do a cloud migration. Yeah, 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 yeah. And you can use this for small projects, by the way. It's just the variability goes up, right? Because the bigger the scope is, this is always the things, right? Then, like I mentioned, hey, your activities one might be more complicated than another one. You're not going to be that exact. Well, if you have a bigger scope, law of averages that out more, right? When you get to a smaller scope, you got to really be careful with, and that's where this drawing up the team and so on helps. If it's a smaller scope, these models are a little more sensitive because the outliers could really swing the estimate. Versus on a bigger scope, these transformations, your finance processes might be on average, activities might be on average harder than your procurement. But if you look at the overall effort, it kind of averages out. Right? But when you have a very small scope, those outliers can cause a lot more pain. Let's say your total effort is, 1,000 hours of work versus 250,000 hours of work. The variability and the standard deviation around the 1,000 hours is a lot higher than the 250,000 hours. So that's something to watch out for. Yeah. 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 By the way, this I just down again. This is just a Google image, but go ahead. What do you go to your question? It's just a Google image. I mean, I just went and Google, and I didn't take anything from. I have ones from my previous company, but I like to not use things from places I've worked, kind of confidentiality reasons. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there are. I mean, there are standard models out there. I don't know if others are on that still know in their head what they're called. There is like a body that has like standards for these capability models, and you can just download them. Yeah, but then you can. Yeah, and when I worked for Deloitte, for example, they had something called was it print or whatever, process print or value print, and then it was called I can't remember, but they had their own decomposition of this, and then they would have them for they'd have print for manufacturing, insurance, pharmaceutical, automotive, and then it would have this model for that specific industry with kind of the nuances of their industry. Um, SAP has the same with if you buy SAP actually in Solution Manager, which is kind of their hub to do project management and all kinds of other stuff, a lot of stuff. But it does that too. It'll have the standard actually already the process flows of the standard SAP processes. It'll have the decomposition of the processes. It has industry solutions SAP. It'll have the specific processes that are enabled by the insurance industry solution or the consulting industry solution or probably more. I don't know if they have a consulting. It's probably more service industry solution. So you should be able to find stuff out there that. And I know there's a standard body. I forgot what its name is. There's a standard body that also builds these, and you can. I think they are by industry. Yeah. Let me. Okay. Yeah. 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 And that's where again it's a different world, right? Because sometimes um, you gotta. I mean, at the end of the day, their process can still be pretty complex and whatever. I don't want to argue that, but they just don't have the resource power to get too proper on all the documentation and so on. It's just they can't afford to, right? So it's kind of an interesting. Yeah, yeah, the same. Yeah, I mean, you can buy time with money. Just hire more people, right? um, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but I find an industry model. What I would do is typically, if I again, I being a consultant for a very long period of my life, and now doing it again. I right now one of my biggest companies is a grocery chain that I'm consulting to, and never worked in a grocery chain. It's all the same. Everybody does the same stuff. Everybody does the same stuff. Hmm. Hmm. Could be yes, yes, yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And again, and that's why what I was getting to is I would pick one of these standard models and change my lingo in my company. But it is amazing how hard that is to do. It always amazes me how the people aspect of what we do in work is huge, and it always baffles me because I come from a science background. I'm German. I have an engineering degree. I'm like kind of like, well, if this is, why don't we leave your personal wishes out, and what's the problem with change? You just do it this way. You did it that way before. Do it this way. What's the problem? Until this the job done. Whoa, most people, it is amazing how much they're set in their way, and changing the way they do things is huge. But I would always go with a standard model. Yeah, it's crazy. It is just amazing to me how much people are set in their way. It baffles me, and they do exactly the same thing. They're doing exactly the same thing. And then what's funny is I love it. Even I've worked for companies that have a lot of independent business units, and one business unit will do. I'll just say inventory management, just as an example. They'll do it a certain way, and then the facility, 100 miles away in the same country, servicing the same countries, will go, well, you can't do that's who would work that way? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Well, okay, one of you two is right or wrong. Oh no, but they won't go and say, well, let's figure out what's best. No, I obviously am best, and that guy's wrong. And then the other one goes, no, I do it the best way. That guy's wrong. I'm like, one of you two is wrong, and one of you two is probably doing it better than the other one. Could you figure that out? Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's amazing. It is amazing to me. It's that's actually what I like about the consulting world, because you see all this stuff. You're kind of like, okay, I've heard this story like 20 times now. I know from the beginning what you after like 4 or 5 sentences. I know you're totally full of shit, because I've heard this 1,000 times from people who just, I'm sorry, you're wrong. It's a funny kind of. But that makes it interesting, right? Because you go to all these different places, you don't get indoctrinated by one company's way of doing things. You kind of see it and you go, well, these four do it better than these eight, but it takes an army to convince these eight that there's a better way to do this, because they're not used to doing it. Yeah, but I don't know how we got on that subject, but yeah, there's standards out there. If I find some, I forget. Oh man, what's the? I know in the manufacturing world there's a whole, but it might be manufacturing oriented. But like I said, all the consulting companies, the big ones, will have these, every one of them, and they'll have them by industry. They'll have them by that they use, right, and they tie their methodology to. And like I say, the big software vendors will have this too. Yeah. Yeah. Let me go to chat.